Hi there, welcome back to another session, and today I'm going to be doing part 2 of the message I did called The Calling. And I spoke a little bit about how people, we are all called to be ministers of the gospel, but there are also some people who are called into specific ministries. And so we looked at Ephesians 4 and what katatismos means, and that the fivefold ministry are called to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. But in this session I want to look a little bit about, just very briefly, about preparation. And when I'll say this again, I may repeat some of the things I said in the first session, but I feel it's important. When people feel called, they think it means they've got to give everything up and live by faith. We all live by faith, by the way. You don't have to be in ministry to live by faith, because we live by faith in who God is and God's ability to keep his people. But we need people. Imagine if everybody who got saved just gave everything up and went into ministry and lived by faith. We wouldn't have the people who called into business. People are called into the marketplace. People are called to support other people who are not called into the marketplace. They're called to raise finance and support the kingdom. Not everybody is automatically called to be a missionary. I used to think that when I was younger, that when full-time ministry meant you were going to leave your job and go and be a missionary somewhere. People are called to that. Those are the sent ones, but we are not all called to live that way. Not everyone's called to lead a church. So the other thing you need to remember about calling is, don't look at what other people do and then think, I can do that too. It has to be a calling of God that you are obeying in order for you to function in it. I spoke about the grace of God that comes on a person to fulfill a function in session 1, if you haven't seen it. So some calling is something specific that God has spoken to you about. Here's the thing about calling. We sit down, a lot of people ask me if I can mentor them into their calling. It depends. I can mentor somebody in the area of the prophetic to a certain degree, but when it comes to your calling, this is between you and God and the preparation that he's going to do in your life to get you ready for what you're called to do. You get coaching where someone comes alongside and they walk you through something and they say, this is what you need to do. You can go for life coaching today. You can get it on the internet. You can become a life coach and get a certificate where somebody will help you to better your life, to make the right decisions. You get mentoring, which is quite similar, but spiritual mentoring is different, where you walk alongside somebody and you minister to them and you answer their questions, but you mentor them in a certain direction. And then you get discipling, and a disciple is someone who is under training. I've got some definitions here. A disciple, the term disciple represents a Greek word, M-A-T-H-E-T-E-S, I will not try and pronounce that, which generally means one who engages in learning through instruction from another, a follower or a pupil. Now, we all need to be discipled and mentored, but the fivefold ministry is here to equip and prepare the saints to do the work of the ministry. So when you feel that you are called, I started out saying that we have sat down with people who say, we feel God has called us. I need to leave my job and this is what we're going to do. But they can't give us any definition to what they feel God is wanting them to do. It's just they want to save the lost. And that's all great and noble. But unless you can, what you feel your calling or your ministry is, there's some kind of definition. It's never going to be recognized by leaders, and that's what you need. You need leaders to recognize you, to draw alongside of you so that you can be accountable and they can help you to move towards your calling. So every calling, it needs to be identified, recognized, and discerned by you as well. Not only your leadership. You have to be able to say, this is what I feel God has said to me, this is what I feel I'm going to do. And I'm not saying you have all the steps in place before you start. It's a process. But in the process of preparation, this is where you find out all these things and how all these things are going to work. But never think that just because you are called to something, it's going to be, now I'm going to go and save the lost. That is the ultimate objective, of course. But you have to be able to define it. It's like a business coming up with a brand that identifies them. What is it in your life that identifies you, that people can say, oh, that person's prophetic, that person's intercessory? You can see it on people, you can hear it in their language. So what can you identify in your life that points you in the direction of how God's going to use you? I'm not saying that's fivefold ministry or full-time ministry, but there's something in you, there's a gift in you that identifies you in the spiritual realm, and other people can see it on you as well. And it takes somebody who has been there before to see something in you and be willing to walk with you and say, I see where God is taking you. Because when you go into a preparation process, you are going to want to give up. You are going to forget the promises that you have. You're going to feel as if you're not making any progress. And then someone who is mentoring you, discipling you, walking with you, can say to you, I see this in your life. They call out the gold in you. They call out the gift and the calling that God has put on your life. They call out the grace that they see on your life that you sometimes cannot see yourself, which is why it's important when you're in a time of preparation that you find the people who God has put in your life and you allow them to speak into your life. That's a big key. We know a lot of people who feel they have a ministry and a gift. Not a lot of people, but a few. And they know what God has said them, God's leading them and guiding them. But if you want to give a little bit of advice or you want to just help them in a certain direction, they can't receive it because they think that they've got it all together already and it's just them and God. That's a dangerous place to be. You have to be open enough for people to speak into your life. I remember in the early days, before Rory and myself were released into ministry, we had hands laid on us, we were ordained, we were released into ministry. It was very official, was done well, the correct way. We had leaders who recognized that we had been called, and they laid hands on us, prayed for us, and released us. And so, but I remember before those days, we were wanting to live by faith. We knew we had a calling on our lives. We knew what we were called to do. But there was this in-between from hearing the calling and actually getting there and doing it. And we saw people doing what we knew we were going to do. And we just thought it was going to happen automatically. But we went into a time of preparation. And during one of those times, I remember we were struggling financially. Fortunately, we didn't have any children at the time, so it was just Rory and myself trying to make ends meet and work things out, and we were very zealous and we would have done anything for God. But we both had given up our jobs. We were trying different things so that we could be more available to God. We had spiritualized it, was living by faith. And so one day our pastor came to see us, and I remember he sat in our lounge. We really respected him. We loved this guy. And he said to us, you know, you guys need to be practical. You can both get a job. You can work, you can get a job. And we didn't really want to hear that because we were very spiritual at the time. And then after he left, we spoke about it and we thought, it's so true. Just because we are getting a job to live doesn't mean that we don't have faith in God. When God hasn't told you to do something, when he hasn't said leave your job, when he hasn't said start a church, when he hasn't said go to wherever, don't do it because you won't have the grace to do it. And you're doing it out of your own idea and not in faith because God had said. So we got jobs and we ended up going to Bible school, being released into ministry. So, you know, even when you make mistakes out of sincerity, God sees that and he rescues his people. He's so gracious and kind with that. But we had to be open to receiving that advice. And so we were very thankful afterwards that we did. So I want to say this to you. I'll give you a little bit of some of my story being called. When you're called to something, this is what happens. God seems to take delight in calling the people who feel as if they're not ready, they're not adequate, they don't have the goods to give. Look through the Bible. Moses felt he couldn't speak. All right throughout the Bible, there are examples of people who God chose and they thought they weren't the ones. But God said, yes, you are, because I'm with you. You got to remember that. in your calling. So what happens is, when God calls somebody, I just want to find my notes here. When God calls people who feel that they're not secure enough, and then you learn to find your security in God. But then there are people who feel that they've got it all together. I know I've got the degrees, I've got this, and then God has still called them. And the same people still go into a preparation process to find out that it's not all those things that you know and all the people you know who you can make things happen. It's about God and how He's going to help you walk out this calling. So every single one of us has to go into a time of preparation. And so in the beginning, I remember, and I'm speaking to you out of what I went through so you can learn something from it. In the beginning, being called into ministry, fortunately, it was Rory and myself together. I wasn't alone, having to go out there and find my way as a woman in ministry. It was Rory and I called together. But I remember on my part, I felt as if I didn't have the goods to give. I didn't have a prophetic ministry. I was hearing from God. I was having dreams back then, and I'm talking over 30 years ago now. I was having dreams. I was hearing from God. I was excited about the things of God, but I didn't want to be this upfront person. I never saw myself as doing this, and I kept getting words that I was called to this and to do this. So I was exposed to my own insecurities. Also, this is what happened, and I had to overcome that by getting to grips with who God saw me to be, that it was His power and not my abilities, and I had to learn to cooperate with the Spirit and step out in faith and say what He gave me to say and do what He told me to do. And I learned a lot in the early days, just spending time with God, interceding about things, and that's where I learned to hear the voice of the Spirit and pray and be the supportive prayer ministry. And so, but what happens is when you get called, you start out with this great enthusiasm because God has called you, you've now been released, and this is going to be amazing. And suddenly, it's almost as if it's just you. How's this going to work now? And this is where the preparation begins, and the faith has to begin to be put into action, and you learn how to trust. You go into the school of trust, and you learn. It may not be exactly the same for everybody, but as I said, I'm speaking from our experiences. It's this, God said you're going to live by faith, and here we are. God said you're going to the nations. We didn't have any money to go anywhere, never mind the nations. We didn't have any connections. We didn't have, business people supporting us. It was just God and us and a calling. And so a lot of our preparation happened in those quiet times, in the times of waiting, in the times of standing, trusting God to provide. And we saw His faithfulness over time and how He taught us principles in the Word about His goodness, about who He is, about how He would keep us. And so there were times I remember what's going to happen is you start out with this great calling, and then as you begin to develop in your calling and doors begin to open and you start to feel more comfortable in this thing, that the people who were around you in the beginning, who you thought would celebrate with you, are suddenly not there. The people who said they would support you, we had people from all over, so I'm going to support you, they disappeared. Almost as fast as those words came out of their mouths, they disappeared. And there were churches who said, we want you back on a regular basis. We went there once, and you begin to get a complex and think, have I done something wrong? And then we realized that this is all how it happens, is that you get your eyes on people hoping that they're going to support you, hoping that they're going to promote you. There are people who would say to us, I'm going to recommend you to all my friends in ministry. Those things hardly ever happen. They did happen. It wasn't all bad news. And also the one thing is that God, in His grace, puts people around you who will pray for you, support you, call out the gold in you. And those people who God has picked will stay with you right through. We have some people who've been with us for many, many years, decades, still supporting us, still believing in us, in what God has put in us, even when we forgot ourselves. There were many days back in the early days when we had given up. We thought, did we make a mistake? Did God call us? And I'm encouraging you by telling you these stories, And then somebody would phone us and say, God woke me up at 2 o'clock this morning and this is what he says to you. This is how God keeps his people who are called. And so this is where, in times like this is where you learn to find the settling that comes, because you say, no matter who celebrates me, who honors me, who closes the door on me, who promised to support and they never follow through, God remains the same. And God is the one who called you, and God is the one who keeps you, and God is the one who promotes you. God said to us in the early days, you don't have to send out emails, or back in the day it was letters, mailing letters, putting stamps on them. How many of you know what a stamp is? You lick it, you put it on a thing, on an envelope, and you put it in a post box, and it gets delivered. It takes 2 weeks to get to another country. So God said to us, you don't have to promote yourself. I'm going to do it. And he did. God has been so faithful to us. But in these times, this is where you learn the value of hiding in God, finding that place of being settled in him, coming to a place of rest so that you hear his voice and you only obey what he tells you to do. When it's God's time for you to step out or be promoted or get exposure in your ministry, he brings you out of hiding. He gives you favor with people you need to have favor with. But if you haven't been faithful in the times of hiding, and you've tried to market yourself and tried to impress everybody by sitting in the front row of the conference and going amen, hallelujah, or trying to prophesy everywhere, then you will wait a little bit longer until you get to the place where you realize you've got to learn to be vulnerable with God and say, God, it's in my weakness that you called me. It's in my insecurities and my inabilities, and I now have to rely on you to get this thing done. So what happens is in your calling, that when you get to this place with God, what I found is it starts out with a whole lot of enthusiasm, and then there's this place where you think, okay, it's not going to happen. And then when you get to the end of yourself, suddenly people are inviting you to preach. Suddenly people remember your name. Suddenly you can't keep up with what God is doing, because God has chosen that time to propel you forward. And it's at that time where you think, but I don't really want to do this. Now I'm happy just to be at home, to sit with God and do nothing. And God says, no, now you're ready. And then at that time, what happens is you're on the road, you see God has put people around you to support you. Then suddenly, when you're not looking for it, the favor comes, the support comes, the provision comes, the open doors, the traveling to the nations. And then amongst all of this, there's this thankfulness to God, because it was his grace that kept you. Then you can never look back and say, I made this happen. I did this because I'm so good at this. And I don't believe anybody ever really does it, but there's the temptation to do it. When I look back and I think of how far God has brought me, from someone who never wanted to say boo or bah, never mind get up and pick up a microphone and prophesy to someone. Now I know it's the power of God, it's the anointing and the calling of God and the grace of God to do what I'm called to do. So now I see there are other people out there God is raising up. They're in the starting blocks and they're full of zeal and enthusiasm. And I want those people, I want to be able to call out the gold in those people. I feel it's something God has given me to do. And be the coach or be the mentor. And I'm not saying I want to spend every day with these people and have coffee and mentor them, because there are leaders in churches to do that kind of thing. But to encourage people this way, to use the tools that I have and the skills God has given me to help other people to step into their calling, and then to see the pitfalls, to see the times where they feel down and be able to pick them up again and just minister into their lives. So this is when you promote others, God promotes you. And there's the cycle of things that happen. There's the sowing and reaping principle when it comes to finance. There's the sowing and reaping principle when it comes to your calling. If you still feel that you're sitting in the starting blocks, there's nobody who recognizes you, all you see are your weaknesses, you're in the best place, because that's when the power of God can come and minister to you and show you and begin to bring a definition to what you're called to do. So just stay in that place. Let God send the right people to you. Let God fulfill the calling, complete the work that he has begun in you, because he's faithful to do that. So be encouraged with that. That was part 2 of the calling. And there are many people who called into prophetic ministry, and In this time, I've been speaking a lot about how God's calling the prophets out of the caves. And there are a lot of people, young, up-and-coming prophets and prophetic people who are sitting in this place saying, we're looking at the people who've gone ahead of us. We want to do what they do. I want to say to you, stay in the secret place with God until He releases you. Don't spread your wings too soon, because then you get hurt, you get injured. There's politics that happens out there. Have people around you who can speak into your life and keep you on that safe path with God to fulfill your calling in these days.